Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our first gathering of Real Talk, Real Change for this 2021-2022 academic year. Before we start in earnest, we'd like to take a moment for a land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a land their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is just the beginning, that we need to commit to deeper learning. Here in our Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the School of Ed, we're continuing to examine our role in helping promote Indigenous education, also in accord with Act 31, and to interfacing more with Native nations. And so we'll let you know more, or there'll be more to come as far as our stance here. My name is Percival Matthews, and I am Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Psychology, and I am now the Interim Associate Dean of the School of Education's Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. But our friends call us OEDI for short. So I stepped in this role in August after LeVar Charleston made the big move up to handle equity, diversity, and inclusion at the campus level. I've got some pretty big shoes to fill, and I actually don't even own a single pocket square. But I actually don't have a bow tie either, but my neckties, they tend to match well. So give me a minute, I'll keep trying, I'll get better. Real Talk, Real Change is brought to you by a joint collaboration between OEDI and PLACE, the school's professional learning and community education, which is part of the University of Madison School of Education. Real Talk, Real Change is a symposium series that focuses on critical issues of equity in education, often centering voices of those from racially, ethnically, and or gender minoritized communities. Real Talk, Real Change brings together expertise of faculty, staff, stakeholders from the broader community to explore critical issues of social justice in education and beyond. Now, we typically have attendance that numbers in the hundreds of folks, and we're oriented towards action, accountability, and inclusion. Today, we're going to focus on ideas highlighted in a recent book authored by Dr. Carl Grant, one of the luminaries who joined us today. In particular, the talk was motivated by James Baldwin's delivery of A Talk to Teachers, urging educators to go for broke. And here we are 60 years later. This episode is still as relevant as ever, and we look forward to comments from the panel and from the audience as we grapple with responses to what it means for teachers, teacher educators, and scholars to go for broke in the service of education. Now, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the coordinating committee. So Dr. Lisa Barker here is the Executive Director of PLACE, and she is also an affiliate faculty in UW-Madison's Department of Curriculum and Instruction. She earned her doctorate in curriculum and teacher education from Stanford University and is interested in how principles and practices of improvisational theater can inform the work of educators. And if you pay attention, you'll see the theatrics come out from her. She can't keep it inside. Dr. Barker taught English education at several universities, including SUNY University of New York, where she helped launch the first MA in Applied Theater in the United States. Dr. Barker began her career as a high school English reading and drama teacher. Dr. Urel Lashley, Urel is the Director of Programs at PLACE, and he is also the Director of Student Empowerment for the Center of Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning. Dr. Lashley is a developmental psychologist interested in self-efficacy and social emotional learning in the arts, academic integrated environments. He's also an accomplished drummer and founder and director of Drum Power, which focuses on social emotional learning through music. And now I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Lisa Barker.
Thank you, Percival. On our next slide, it tells you a little bit how we'll be spending our time together. Right now, I'm tasked with pastor number 2, so I'm really happy to let you know what our guiding questions are tonight, as well as introduce you to our panelists. Then the panelists will each have about 10 minutes to respond to that set of questions. Then we'll be opening it up to a Q&A that's very much fueled by the questions you pose in the chat. So we really welcome y'all's involvement in the chat at any point in our conversation this evening. Then we'll also have space for panelists to provide some closing thoughts, as well as to hear from Percival again and give y'all an opportunity to give us a bit of feedback about how we can continue to serve you. On the next slide, we have our central questions that we'd love to stay anchored to tonight. So Percival mentioned that Going for Broke is mentioned in the 1963 Talk to Teachers by James Baldwin, and we're going to spend some time defining what that means for us in education, and what that means in our work, what it means for teachers and teacher educators and scholars. Number two, what needs to change? And number three, how we all on this call in our various roles can work together to make that vision a reality. And now I have the honor, on the next slide, you'll see images of our panelists. And I'm actually going to read aloud their bios in the order that we'll be hearing from them in just a moment as they think about those questions. First, Carl A. Grant is the Huffs Bascom Professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and former chair of the Afro-American Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's spent over 40 years researching, teaching, thinking, and writing about some of the key enduring issues in multicultural education. He's contributed to a multitude of books and articles and is former president of the National Association for Multicultural Education. Most recently, he published the book James Baldwin and the American Schoolhouse. Gloria Ladson-Billings is Professor Emerita and the former Kellner Family Distinguished Chair in Urban Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction here at the UW. Her research examines the cultural foundations of teaching and learning that leads to educational improvement for students who are most marginalized in schools. She is a former president of the American Educational Research Association, recently completed her 4-year term as president of the National Academy of Education, was elected this past summer as a fellow to the British Academy, and last week received the Horace Mann League's 2022 Outstanding Public Educator Award. Gloria has authored several critically acclaimed books, such as The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of African American Children, Crossing Over to Canaan, The Journey of New Teachers in Diverse Classrooms, and Culturally Relevant Pedagogy, Asking a Different Question. Mariana Pacheco is an associate professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction here at the UW. Her scholarship focuses on meaningful opportunities for bilingual and multilingual students to use their cultural, linguistic, and cognitive resources for learning and self-determination. She focuses on Chicano, Latino, and immigrant and migrant students, and her work helps educators organize learning that enhances these students' academic potential and life chances. And finally, we have Cavi Hong. Cavi is an English teacher at Verona Area High School in Verona, Wisconsin, as well as the 2022 Wisconsin Teacher of the Year. He gained recognition as a featured presenter for the New York Times and its webinars on how to teach students to think critically and write strong argumentative essays. He presented with Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof on a 2017 webinar on how to teach argumentative writing. He is also a nationally board certified teacher who teaches 9th grade English along with advanced placement language and composition. So with that, I would like to hand it off to Dr. Carl Grant to talk a bit about what going for broke in education means, what needs to change, and what we all can do to get there.
Thank you. Thank you. It's terrific to be here, and it is really wonderful to work with such outstanding colleagues. And I really want to thank you for inviting me to participate. When I think of basically going for broke, I had to wonder, where did this come from? How did it come to be? Why did Jimmy Baldwin use a phrase in talking to teachers in that wonderful speech that he gave on October the 16th, 1963? So part of what I did was to do some background work on discovering where did it come from. And what I learned from that is not only what it meant to Jimmy Baldwin at the time, but what it meant to me and the work that I do at this time. And I thank all of us who are panelists here today. But I want to start about 5 months before that October day. And for us to go back and to think about that time. And we can relate that particular time to what we're living through today. Because what we're living through today in many ways reflects that time. In May of 1963, 4,000 African American elementary and secondary school students from across the country traveled to Birmingham, Alabama to protest racial segregation. And in June, Medgar Evers was killed. In August, we had the famous March on Washington, where Martin Luther King spoke, and we definitely remember that time. In September, we had the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And so Baldwin, with those events basically as a backdrop, walked into the school to give a talk to teachers. And at first it wasn't called a talk to teachers. It had a different name. And he had been invited to come there to talk about to help the teachers think about the self-worth of the students. And he began his talk with, let's begin saying that we're living through a very dangerous time. I would say today, we're also living through a very dangerous time. I mean, dangerous within this country and dangerous outside of the country. But Baldwin said that what he was talking about was the danger that was going on within the country. And he said, let's begin by saying we're living through a very dangerous time. The societies in which we live are desperately menaced, not by outside forces, but from within. To any citizen who figures oneself as responsible, in particular to those of us who deal with the minds and the hearts of young people, we must be prepared to go for broke. Baldwin was speaking of helping young people to work toward transforming education. And he was asking teachers to be very much involved in conducting critical thinking as they thought about how they were going to teach the students, and not just engage in compliance education, but to come in realizing that if society was going to be changed, or if the schooling of the young people were going to be changed, that they would have to go for broke. And what he meant by that is going all out to really work to make this change. When I look around today, I see going for broke in many different places, within education and outside of education. When I looked at the Super Bowl only about 10 days ago, what we saw in the halftime presentation, one could argue, was a form of going for broke. And recently, we have engaged in a number. The mother of Marbury went for broke when she insisted that there be a second trial. So the notion of going for broke speaks to going all out in what you are doing and what you are engaged with. As I think about my work and relate that to going for broke, it means really digging into it and making certain that you look at it from a critical perspective, that you have a vision for what you wish the world to be and how you want schools to be. So it is an all-out action to make sure that all students are included in what's going on in classroom, and the voices that are often left out, that are so-called marginalized, are brought to the center. So the notion of going for broke means the centering of students who are also left out and bringing them into the center so they can actively participate and feel that the schools are very much for them. Is there time?
Thank you, Dr. Grant. Yeah, you're doing great on time. Actually, that was a really helpful historical context to going for broke and unpacking of what that looks like. To orient you to the second and third questions, we're also really interested to hear what, from your perspective, you think needs to change and what we all can do in our various roles to make that change happen.
Well, let me say, I believe that schools really need to be reimagined. One of the more disappointing aspects of being in COVID and coming out of COVID is the realization that we learned a great deal about schooling and education in this country through COVID and what people were saying. But I heard very little about what change are we going to engage in after COVID, especially as far as Black and brown kids are concerned. It was more or less, let's just reopen schools, get them back in school. But what changes will we introduce now that we're getting a different handle on COVID? So the changes that we need to institute within school, which has to be deal with curriculum, has to be bringing to make certain we have teachers of color in, to making certain that students that we are working with better understand what culturally relevant pedagogy is about and what multicultural education is about. So when James Baldwin speaks of going for broke, part of what he is saying that we need to have critical thinking, we need to have a vision for what we want to do, and that vision needs to include reimagining schools. And that is the part of the work that I'm very much interested in. How do we think about schools now that we are in a different point? And it's for certain that much of that is going on that is pushing against multicultural education, culturally relevant pedagogy, is saying we need to go back, and I think we need to push hard against that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grant. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings to respond to those questions about what going for broke means to her, what needs to change, and what we can all do together to bring that vision to reality.
Well, thank you, Lisa and Percival, for setting this up and inviting me. And I want to thank my colleague, Carl Grant, for really setting out the actual contours of what the debate is involved in. I'll use the metaphor when you say, what does it mean to go for broke? Anybody's ever been in a casino environment knows that there's often a point at the table where someone might feel like they're on a hot streak and they take everything they've won thus far and they say, I'm all in. In other words, they hold back no chips. They don't say, well, if it doesn't land on my number, then it's going to be over. I'm going to have something on the side. Going for broke for me is the same as saying I'm all in. And I love that Dr. Grant gave us a bit of a historical context. I'm going to piggyback on that context, but make it personal. My own education, pre-teaching, was bookended by two major events: the assassination of Malcolm X in February of 1965, and the murder of Martin Luther King in April of 1968. And so I walk into a classroom as a teacher in the fall of 1968, and there is no way that I can, as a social studies teacher too, not engage students in the issues of the day, the issues that are relevant for them, the issues that are plaguing them, and the issue that the curriculum doesn't address in any way. And so that was my attempt to be all in, to go for broke and essentially say, I can't get up each day, show up in a community that is serving Black, brown, and working class youngsters whose futures look pretty dim, and then just kind of lead them through a prescribed curriculum. So my vision of going for broke is trying to figure out how do you address your whys, WHY? You know, why are you even there? How do you address those? And I thought that, you know, one of my big whys was to ensure that these children got a fair shot at a good education. And I also want to be clear to particularly our practitioners in the field that there's a difference between being bold and courageous and being reckless. And I think that one of the places where often people get confused is that they think they can just, quote, do anything without having built the requisite coalitions. You know, Dr. Grant gave us examples of things like the March in Selma and the other kinds of advocacy. All of that work, none of that work is spontaneous. None of that work is seat of the pants. People planned, people strategized, people figured out, okay, we have to do this and then we have to do that. If you saw the film version of Selma, what you saw is that on the second trip, there was incredible planning that said, you know, they're probably still going to meet us. They're probably still going to try to beat us. But at least one of the things we want to make sure is that we have enough eyes on what happens, that we have enough witnesses to what happens, that we are, you know, that people will at least can't say that, oh, that's not happening or that's not going on. So for me, going all in is really being willing to put everything on the line, but to do it in a way that reflects the planning and the strategy and the coalition building so that you might be successful. The point is not to go out and be a martyr. The point is to be able to affect change. And talking about this notion of what needs to change, since the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic struck, I've been looking at the nature of pandemics, been very, very influenced by the work of an Indian novelist by the name of Arundhati Roy, who says, you know, the pandemic is really a portal. This is no different than any other pandemic that we've experienced before. It is an opportunity to move from the past and to move into the new. I mean, one of the things that people don't recognize is in 1918, when we had the so-called Spanish flu pandemic, what comes out of that is the Harlem Renaissance. People weren't just sitting around doing nothing, that it was a way to remake their world. And I've argued that our young people are in the midst of 4 pandemics. not just COVID-19. COVID-19 is the obvious one. It's the one that is, causes us that meet in this particular way and use our technologies differently. But we also have a pandemic of racism. And that came through in not just the murder of George Floyd, but the kind of responses that I received around the world post George Floyd. I didn't just hear from people in the US, I heard from colleagues in the UK. I heard from colleagues in France. I heard from colleagues in Canada. I heard from colleagues in Australia, all of whom had a story about how racism is shaping and continuing to challenge the lives of people in their nation states. So that's the second pandemic. The third pandemic is, I believe, an economic one. It is trailing, of course, the COVID pandemic, but the fact is that some people have not been able to get back to work. If what you did for a living was be a waitress and your restaurant closed down, you probably just lost a job. We also know something like 2.2 million women left the workforce as a result of COVID-19. Some of them voluntarily, others because they had no other choice. A lot of them having to be caregivers either for children or elders. A lot of people just losing jobs. And so there's a ripple effect. And again, it's pandemic because people on this side of the world are not consuming. People on other parts of the world can't be producing. So it resonates throughout the global economy. And then the fourth pandemic, which I think we give lip service to, but I'm not sure we are taking as serious as it really is the impending environmental catastrophe. It's not a joke. And our young people care about this. There was a study done at the University of Bath, a survey of 25,000 students around the globe, and their number one concern is climate change. And linked to that concern is their belief that the so-called adults that are responsible aren't taking it serious. So our young people are walking around with all four of these concerns each and every day. So what needs to change? I think Dr. Grant did a great job by talking about the reimagining education. I think I had written on my notes, we needed to, what needs to change is that we have to rethink what we mean by education. You are kind enough to read my bio, but a piece of the bio that wasn't there has to do with my community involvement. I sit on a lot of nonprofit boards. I chair the board for the Urban League of Greater Madison. I'm on the board for the United Way of Dane County. I'm on the Madison Children's Museum board. I'm on the Madison Community Foundation board. I'm on the One City Schools board. I'm on all these nonprofit boards, and what I have said to each and every one of them, you cannot think of your work as after school work. The question is not about what needs to change in terms of schooling, it's what needs to change in terms of education. And in my mind, seeing what I've seen post-COVID is that there is no after school. We learned that kids could go to school all kinds of hours, if we use these technologies well. And our high schoolers would much rather go later, and they're okay going to school in the evening. We also learned that the technologies gave the students a lot more control over their learning experience. I'm of the mindset, and I'm very concerned that we haven't taken the advice of Rahm Emanuel, who I think stole this from Winston Churchill, that you never let a good crisis go to waste. I think we've let it go to waste. I think we were so concerned about just opening schoolhouse doors and getting everybody back. And our often repeated phrases, we got to get back to normal. But we never looked at what did normal look like for the poorest kids in our community? What does normal look like for kids whose first language is other than English? What does normal look like for kids who have been over-identified for special education? what does normal look like for kids who have no access to honors and gifted programs? So for me, and I've used the phrase, I've written about it, it is time for an education reset. We need to take advantage of the full stop that COVID-19 presented us and really rethink how we reintroduce children and young people to formal education. And I think I'll just stop there. I know we have other speakers.
Thank you, Dr. Ladson-Billings. I really appreciate you unpacking the various pandemics we're all swimming through. And I just also want to say thank you so much for your local service on all our boards and your community involvement. We're all collecting lots of questions, both from the chat. So thanks to y'all who have direct messaged or made public your questions in the chat. And we're also accumulating questions, both also in response to the offers that our panelists are bringing forth. I want to transition to Mariana Pacheco to give her space and time to think about these questions also.
Hi, good evening. Buenas tardes. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. And it's so intimidating to be on this panel with these two amazing colleagues and scholars. But like Lisa said in the introduction, in my work, I study multilingualism and multiliteracy. And I'm really glad that Carl and Gloria were able to preceded me the way that they did, because I think I'd like to focus, I looked at the questions and I'm focusing more on the work that I've done and like its implications for teachers and what I think it means to go for broke in education related to what I've learned in my own research. So I study bimultilingualism and bimultiliteracy processes. I focus on Chicano and Latino students, and some of those include immigrants or the children of immigrants. In my work, I challenge the deeply deficit views that we have of non-white students, non-dominant students, and I focus on language and culture. I've tried documenting in my own work, not only these students' linguistic repertoires and discourses outside of school, to think about how we might leverage them or build on them in classrooms and in schools. But also I've documented opportunities that exist for them already outside of school and at times within schools to build on those repertoires and those resources. And so for me, going for broke in education related to what I've learned, because we make so many assumptions about what it means to be learning English as a second language, to be a sort of newcomer, to be constructed as a perpetual foreigner. And ultimately it's about the differences that Chicano and Latino students who come from homes where Spanish might be the home language or bilingualism might be the home language. Ultimately, I think in education, we construct these differences as deficiencies that need to be fixed and need to be addressed. So while my work is focused on the language piece of that, because in education, especially in ESL and bilingual education, there is such an insistence on focusing on language discretely and language learning and development, which I think is appropriate. I also have sought to, and I care more about also, I would say, thinking about language and how it mediates different ways of being, different sensibilities, a different kind of awareness, a different kind of consciousness. In other words, when your whole life is about movement, mobility, shifting across languages, across borders, across social worlds, across worldviews, obviously across school and home, which might be spaces and contexts that look very different. I draw on frameworks primarily by a queer Chicana named Gloria Nsaldúa, whose work I highly value, to think about these border crossing experiences, as she calls them, this border crossing, not just as movement, but as engendering particular epistemologies and knowledges, right? So that when your experiences are shaped and defined by border crossing, and I don't mean just a lot of her work, she was from Southern Texas, and a lot of her work's focused on the border. She also talked about the psychological borderland. So we would say that even by multilingual Chicano and Latino youth in Wisconsin might be experiencing these border crossings, even though we're far away, at least from the US-Mexico border, the US, Southern US border. But as they're crossing these borders across linguistic worlds, social worlds, cultural worlds, that they are developing unique ways of understandings. And so I think going for broke in education for me means completely doing away, fully and intentionally, deliberately doing away with dominant notions of a standard or sets of standard, dominant notions of academic language, dominant notions of, what it means to be mainstream, dominant notions of one size fits all, and instead centering the diversity of ways of using languages, our diverse cultural experiences and knowledges, and our diverse cultural ways of being, the diverse ways we embody our histories, our social and cultural histories, in the ways that we think about, in the ways children think about the world, in the way they talk about the world, and the unique knowledge they bring to school. So I think in classrooms, this would mean centering students' voices and experiences, right? Not decentering this top-down, one-size-fits-all approach that we enact in schools, and instead thinking more in terms of bottom-up and starting from making space for students' voices and experiences. And I just wanted to share a couple of examples. One of them is from a summer youth program with Hmong and Latino youth, where we invited them to to develop what's called the testimonio, also from Gloria and Saldua's work, but we had them write these narratives, these autobiographical narratives. And they were able to talk about their experiences. They were able to share their, not only were they able to, but they really loved and appreciated sharing their histories of mobility, histories of migration. I know our Hmong student really talked about, her story was all about legacy and reputation, because in her Hmong family, that was, legacy and reputation is what connected her to multiple generations that came before her. And so we just implemented that program last summer, but what was most fascinating was, these Hmong and Latino youth from Wisconsin, and from mostly Wisconsin, just appreciated and valued the opportunity to tell their story. Like that acknowledged that in schools, they don't typically, in classrooms, they don't typically have space to tell their stories, much less in the discourses and the repertoires in that they want to tell their stories in. And some of their stories were about going for broke in their own personal lives as immigrant youth, but also the children of immigrants. I also wanted to share a personal, I was inspired by Gloria and Carl. There also, I think, when we make space for students and parents and families' voices and experiences, we make space for what I'm conceptualizing as like the spirit of going for broke among some of these Chicano Latino children and their parents and families. So I actually wanted to share a poem that was written by my mom, who passed in April. It's written in Spanish, but I'll share the text and I'll share the English translation. Trust me, it sounds 100 times better in Spanish and more beautiful and more poetic. But I share this poem with teachers and with my pre-service teachers in my classes, because I talk about the fact that teachers, no single teacher ever stepped foot in my home. And yet my mom was an avid writer. She kept a daily journal. She talked about her life experiences, and she was a poet, unpublished, but she was a poet. And people that read her work, I always think like, man, she could have been a published poet. She could have been amazing, right? And so I wanted to share this poem to, and I share it to highlight the fact that had teachers, had educators then and now, you know, went into people's homes, into Chicano, Latino, multilingual students' homes, we constructed so different. Had they gone into my home, my family home, where there might have been no books, there was lots of newspapers, lots of magazines, lots of songbooks. My mom loved to sing and loved to read, borrow books from the library in Spanish about, songbooks with the lyrics. This is 1980. But you would have also seen her journals and seen her poetry, right? And these aren't the things that we, when we make assumptions about children and families we deem as culturally and linguistically different from us, that we miss a lot of what they can contribute to education and to education, change in education and social transformation. So I'll read this poem. It's called The Migrant. And like I said, the English is on the right-hand side. I really wish there was a more beautiful way I could represent the Spanish, but it's, something's always lost in translation. But it's written from the perspective of migrant children and immigrant children. And it's sort of my mom's poem, like on behalf of migrant children who are new to the US and who have hopes and dreams. And I think it reflects like a spirit of going for broke. So I'll end with that, and I'll go ahead and share my screen and share this poem. Thank you for indulging me. You can see that. El Emigrante, por Mariana Pacheco Álvarez, 1994. Somos los niños emigrantes, hijos de unos campesinos, que por causa del destino viajamos por estos caminos. Queremos que nos escuchen, queremos que nos entiendan. Aquellos que sean amigos, aquellos que nos comprendan. En estas manos pequeñas tenemos nuestro futuro. Hay que levantar la frente con dignidad y orgullo. Mi madre es campesina, mi padre es labrador. Y yo, pues igual a ellos, quiero ser trabajador. Yo les digo a mis hermanos cuando vayan a estudiar que a todo el profesorado tenemos que respetar. Leyes de Estados Unidos no nos nieguen la opción de ser todos como hermanos y tener una ilusión. Somos los niños emigrantes los que vamos a estudiar para gritar con orgullo, viva nuestra libertad. Ya con esto los despido, no se les vaya a olvidar que a este país venimos a tratar de progresar. Estos versos con anhelo, una madre escribió por todas las atenciones que de ustedes recibió. So thanks on behalf of my mom, on behalf of me, but like I said, obviously there's lots there, but missed, by the educators in my own life. So thanks for indulging me and my mom.
What a gift, Mariana. I'm going to try. Thank you for bringing your mom. And I know from everyone's work, from having read it, from having heard podcasts and talks, that we're all bringing our parents, our siblings, our children to this work. And we can't separate those things. That was just such a lovely gift. Thank you for that. And I love how you brought in borderlands. And then there was very much the juxtaposition of language and reading that aloud. I also wanted to lift up a piece that Mariana co-authored with our colleague, Nicole Louie, who's also a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. And I popped it in the chat, but it's called Love as a Necessary Corrective Toward Anti-Racist Schools for Our Children. I just really appreciate that essay on how love can be a kind of change and how y'all think about that work. I also want to pass the baton to Cavi Hong, our Wisconsin Teacher of the Year, to give him space to respond to his definitions for going for broke, as well as the changes that we need to see.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I am so honored and grateful to be part of this incredibly distinguished panel, and I'm just learning so much just by being on the call, so thank you. When people find out that I'm a teacher, it's my 21st year of teaching, they talk to me about how tough the year must have been, but it's not for the reasons that most people think. It has nothing to do with COVID. It's really the other three pandemics that Professor Ladson-Billings had mentioned, and especially the pandemic of racism. I think trying to make a student feel valued and worthwhile while you're over a Zoom is incredibly difficult to nearly impossible. And that's been the hardest part of teaching during this time period. To kind of understand, how I interpret Baldwin's line, to go for broke, you kind of have to go back to when I was in high school. I grew up in a small rural farming community in northern Missouri called Trenton, and we were the only Asian American family in town. I did everything I could to be invisible, but it's impossible when you have almond-shaped eyes and your first name is Cavi. So I love school though, and I love to learn, and my school's curriculum though wasn't controversial. There were no angry school board meetings. There are no laws being passed to regulate teachers. And it was really considered to be a, quote, neutral curriculum. In English class, we read the classics, which consisted of Mark Twain and Charles Dickens and F. Scott Fitzgerald. I never read a book by someone that looked like me. I didn't even know that Asian Americans wrote literature until I graduated from college. We read one book from a writer of color, and that was Native Son by Richard Wright. My 16-year-old self couldn't understand why the main character did what he did. We never entered into discussion about what forces drove him and what the author was trying to accomplish. I was just left confused. In history class, we learned about the founding fathers and the Revolutionary War, World War II, but the focus was always on the accomplishments of one group and not the diverse hands that truly built this country. And growing up, I never liked being Asian American. For the longest time, I wanted to be Steve Garvey. He was the first baseman for the LA Dodgers. And when I started teaching, I basically taught like I was taught, which I think a lot of teachers do. My curriculum consisted of the classics. And as a new teacher, I really didn't question it. I was in my comfort zone. And looking back now, I see how problematic that was. It took me a few years really to kind of start questioning my practice and to kind of gain a sense of confidence and a sense of pride in myself, not just only as an educator, but also as an Asian American. And I so relate to what Professor Pacheco talked about, the perpetual foreigner, because that is something that I definitely have felt throughout my life. And I realize now that there's really no such thing as a neutral curriculum. You're either having a one-dimensional conversation about race or identity, or a multi-dimensional conversation about it. And really my growth as an educator and as a person came from that realization and how important it is to really question the lens that I use to teach and view my students. And I'll cite Professor Grant and Dean Gillette, their 2006 Journal of Teacher Education article. I did go back and read it. And I love this line from it because I think it so relates to my growth as a teacher. The term reflective practitioner means different things to different people. To us, it means a teacher who not only thinks about what is happening in the classroom, but also researches his or her own classroom practice to make changes that will result in a more democratic, ethical, and student-centered classroom. If teachers don't question the goals, values, and assumptions that guide their work and don't examine the context in which they teach, then they are not engaged in good reflective teaching. It kind of goes back to what Professor Ladson-Billings was talking about. How do you not address what is happening in the world around you? And to me, this paragraph encapsulates what it means to go for it. I'm 49 years old and I'm the beginning stages of this self-examination. And I'm frustrated that it's taken me this long to kind of get there, but it's made me a better teacher and more importantly, a better person. And I think our kids really need to see themselves in the school curriculum. Just because some in our society don't want to talk about race or identity doesn't mean that the issues of race or identity don't come up in our students' lives. Those incidents are often ugly, dehumanizing, and violent. And the thing I love about working in public education is that it brings together people from all different races, nationalities, and backgrounds. As teachers, we often model a level of civil discourse that is often missing amongst adults. Sadly, my kids are sometimes better than many of the adults in terms of modeling really this kind of discourse that we want in our society. I was recently on a Zoom call with other 49 state teachers of the year, and we spent very little time talking about the COVID pandemic. Our most pressing topic that we talked about was really the nationwide effort to hide the truth and really intimidate teachers into not talking about issues of race and identity. Just two quick anecdotes. I talked to the Oklahoma Teacher of the Year, and she talked about students being encouraged to sort of film teachers and report them for talking about race issues. The Maine Teacher of the Year has talked about having publicly had to defend herself for talking about racial justice in her classroom. And so, unfortunately, many of the state teachers of the year have very similar stories. And I know that if you're a teacher on this call, you're probably thinking about the bills being passed here in Wisconsin and really how to navigate a world where every conversation seems really fraught with uncertainty. Baldwin writes that, and I love this line in his essay, in the attempt to correct so many generations of bad faith and cruelty, when it is operating not only in the classroom, but in society, you will meet the most fantastic, the most brutal, and the most determined resistance. There is no point in pretending that this won't happen. I think that is true, but I also think that we're not helpless to this tide. Hope is not just a state of being, but it's an action. And I am hopeful that we can continue to stand up for all of our students and to create a learning environment that not only builds their skills, but also builds empathy for people that don't look like them. So I'll stop there, and then I think we'll move to questions, right?
That's exactly right. Thank you so much, Cavi. It was sort of beautiful how we bookended the panelist response section with pieces of James Baldwin's writing. And I really appreciate, we're getting all kinds of questions, direct messaged and public in the chat. And I want to open up the pasture where we spend some time together responding to those questions. And I'll ask this question, and I'll actually start with Cavi, but make space for all kinds of folks to respond. But really appreciate, Cavi was saying that he was on a call with the Teachers of the Year and talking about how we do this good work in the context of the legislation movements that are happening. And the question that we received, which I'll also copy and paste in the chat, just so everyone can have that there, is how would the panelists advise future and current teachers, school leaders to go for broke, addressing recent law changes in some United States regarding critical race theory as interpreted, and those laws attempting to censor critical and truly patriotic discussion of CRT issues. So what does going for broke look like in the current context of the way that legislation is interpreting and operationalizing responses to critical race theory, in quotation marks?
Well, I wish I had the correct answer for it, because I think I'm still navigating that myself. But I think I'll go back to what Professor Ladson-Billings talked about, and not wanting to be a martyr, and to form alliances and to go about it in a smart way. I think, teaching in a curriculum that recognizes different voices is always something that is important for teachers, and talking about race in our country. But if you look at the bills, unfortunately, they define critical race theory in such a broad way that it makes it very difficult for you to have any conversation that unfortunately is not running afoul of the law itself. But I think this is something that, as educators here in Wisconsin, we're going to have to learn to navigate, because, we're making tremendous strides in terms of trying to diversify the curriculum and to bring more voices into the classroom. And when you bring in those voices, you naturally talk about race and identity issues that often come with those. So it's really difficult and nearly impossible to kind of separate those out from what's happening in the stories.
Thank you, Cavi. And I also, Gloria, I wanted to hand it off to you because you've done some really excellent work lately to, well, throughout your career, but especially lately, given light of the legislation, to define critical race theory in such a clear way, which I think it's important to sort of define it for this community so we know we can unpack the question a bit more. Would you do that for us?
So before responding directly to your question, I just want to make sure that we understand that the fight that is going on is not about critical race theory. We're trying to have the wrong fight. These are folks who, the fight is about the 2022 and 2024 election. That's what the fight is about. And it's been wrapped around these issues because those issues galvanize a particular group of people. How many people remember the Tea Party, right? It wasn't about taxes. It wasn't even about Obamacare. It was about, we don't want this person to be the president. So those of us who might see ourselves on the left are often fighting the battle they placed ahead in front of us while they go on and wage the other battle. You know, if I'm someone who wants to fight, I'm looking for school board candidates. I'm looking for congressional candidates because that's the fight I need to get into. I'm never going to change the balance if I don't have the votes. That's just the reality of it. I actually did a presentation yesterday here in Florida for a group of people in a community that has about 800 households. There are about 7 or 8 Black households of that 800. So my audience was mostly white. And I did this whole thing for them on why we have to have Black history. And, you know, at the end, people kept saying, oh my God, that was so wonderful. Oh, I wish I knew that. Oh, I never heard of that before. And I said, did anything I said make you feel bad about yourself? You know, and I mean, I really walked them back through all of the attacks, and everybody said, "Oh no, we need more of this. We need to, you know, we just don't know this information." So, from a tactical point of view, what I would argue is that school leaders, teachers have to come together and not wait for a school board meeting, but to bring their communities into the buildings to have the discussion. People have a right to be heard, but I think that the way it's being framed is that they're doing something to your kid. And I think in any instance where, you know, people are upset or concerned about the nature of the curriculum, you've got to have an open and honest conversation. You know, I remember when everybody was upset about, oh gosh, Common Core. Now, I'm no fan of Common Core, but I often ask the question, show me what in this you don't want kids to know. And people couldn't show me anything. So often there's a rallying around something without a real deliberative discussion. And to the degree that we can get parents and community members to sit down in their local schools, not at the school, because I don't even believe half of them people at the school board meetings, even in the district. I really do. I think that you're looking at operatives. But I want the parents of the children we are serving. I want the people who live in that community to be able to come into to the school and tell me, what is it that you don't want to happen? Now, I'll say this and let it go. The people who are proposing all of this stuff probably don't understand anything about child and adolescent development. Because if you want kids not to do something, you know, if you want to make sure that they don't do something, the last thing you do is tell them they can't do it. Because these kids are burning up the internet looking for critical race theory. I get 3 or 4 inquiries every day from high school students. can you tell me about critical race theory? So I feel like Allen Iverson in the midst of all of this. My haters are making me great. I mean, I wrote a book that I didn't think anybody would buy, right? Another academic esoteric book. Publisher says this thing is flying off the shelves. Not because people care about it, but it's been ginned up and made sort of a media frenzy. And I think we have to be able to step back, try to figure out what is the issue we're actually debating here. And can we finally, can we, I think most people want to be heard. And what is it that they want to be heard around? Yesterday I presented people with the Ruby Bridges book and they were appalled that was a book that was being considered to be banned. And then I gave them a bigger context. I said, what does book banning pretty much represent to us as Americans? Totalitarianism, authoritarianism, Nazism. It's not who we are. So, I mean, I think there's some opportunities for us, but again, I think what has to get done in coalition. You cannot go out here by yourself trying to lead the charge because they're gonna kill you, at least professionally, and that's not what we want to happen.
Thank you, Gloria. I wanted to make space for Carl or Mariana if you wanted to respond to this question about what going for broke looks like in the current legislative context around CRT interpretations.
Mariana?
I knew you were going to do that. I think, one thought that I had was that just because these legislative efforts are happening doesn't mean you can't have critical and truly more patriotic discussions of issues related to CRT, right? I mean, I would hate to think that just because of the backlash that now there are no critical or democratic deliberations in any classrooms and schools anywhere, just because that's happening. The other thought I have is that there are no better allies than the students in the schools, right? There's more of them than sometimes. There's more of them at the school than there are of the parents or the school board members. So I think students can be amazing allies. And I think the issue, I see it as generational. I think youth nowadays are more primed to have those kinds of critical discussions. And so I think they could be allies in that way, and they can learn a lesson about being critical and engaging in praxis and being patriotic by taking up this issue maybe locally in student-initiated, student-driven ways. And I think the same for parents, although I say that and then I realize like that might be a challenge in some places, but parents could also be allies. So I think those are my thoughts about that.
Here's what I would like to add. And this is something that I think as educators, teachers, we're going to constantly hear. On Sunday night, I started an essay, Courage, Be You, Teacher. Because I do believe that teachers are going to have to stand up, educators are going to have to stand up, parents are going to have to stand up and have courage. I mean, the question is, if we retreat in this time, what's going to happen? I started earlier by saying over 400 students, young elementary and high school kids, walked to Birmingham, Alabama to stand up. Things may get rough, but I would argue that, and this is what Baldwin speaks to in a talk to teachers, that in some ways we have to rise up and not lay down. And otherwise, things will not get better for a number of years. And the final point, if we do not stand up and speak truth to power, what's going to happen to students?
Thank you, Dr. Grant. It's come up a few times where Gloria had mentioned coalitions and teachers needing to find the requisite coalitions. And Mariana also mentioned young people as allies for one another and for teaching. Can we talk a little bit about the ways that either, several of us have been teachers on this call, so the ways that we found coalition in our work, how we define coalition or recommendations for folks who are looking for coalition. Gloria, I might start with you since I'm borrowing that terminology.
Okay, thank you. I have to tell you that when I began my teaching career, and I think probably many people have tuned into the new sitcom Abbott Elementary, I get such a kick out of that series because it's set in Philadelphia, and I think she's in South Philly, and that's actually where I started teaching. And in fact, I had a colleague just like her colleague, the Italian-American woman. And for me, it was a man by the name of Joe Norelli. If you wanted something that the district wouldn't give you, you just went to Joe Norelli. And Joe would tell you, I can get it for you, but you can't tell nobody where you got it from. We just saw, Joe was the hookup. He was the plug. But I will tell you, when I got there, I was really alone because there were almost no Black teachers in my school. I was working in a working class, white, ethnic community that was busing Black kids down there. And so not only were they being somewhat abusive to the Black children, they were abusive to me. And I'm talking about parents calling me the N-word, basically saying that their kid's not going to be in no classroom with no N-word. I mean, that was my first year. One of my kids' parents passed away, and I went to the wake. He was an Irish-American man. And I went to the wake. I was all of 20 years old. And I was so afraid because I didn't realize that they was going to have the body in the house. And these are very little houses, these little row houses. And I don't mean to be stereotypical, but Black people don't want to be around no bodies outside of the funeral parlor or the church. So you got a body in there. And something just told me to stay. And I stayed throughout the wake. It began to change my relationship with the whole community. People were saying, she came to our house and she sat with us, and we were drinking Irish whiskey and telling tales about Doherty, and this happened, that happened. And slowly but surely, people began to trust me and see that I had their kids' best interests at heart. So it's not going to happen overnight. You have to be a part of the community. You have to be willing to attend events. I have been to more bar mitzvahs, quinceañeras, homegoings, because it just comes with the work that you are saying that I'm recognizing your humanity and I am here. And there's a powerful impact on families when you say to them, your life matters to me. So I'm not saying that you want to be sort of instrumental in the development of the coalition. I think you want to develop the coalition because you want a better working relationship with people. You want to share your humanity with them and to experience their humanity. So I've done things in classrooms that someone might regard as controversial, but I always had a backup of parents who said, no, this is a woman who has our young people, our children's best interests. But you got to build that. You cannot presume you can just make that happen.
It's beautiful, the notion of sharing humanity, but also showing up in ways that are deeply human. Want to make space for our other panelists. If you feel so moved to speak to coalition building, recommendations from your own practice or strategies you've built over the years or ways that you define coalition.
Well, when I was teaching in Chicago, each school year, I would use the first 2 weeks of the semester to go and visit the homes of the students in my class. And that would include also on weekends. And in some of those housing projects in Chicago, where you almost really needed to know someone to go in, I would take the students with me, one or two of the students, and they would say to people, here's our teacher, he's coming to see our parents. And so once you reached out and you would knock on the door and say, Mrs. Smith, Mr. Brown, I am Michael's teacher or Mary's teacher, often they were shocked that I was coming. But after that, as Gloria was saying, you begin to develop that relationship, then within a year or so, your reputation precedes you. They begin to expect it. And it works out. I mean, when you boil down, people are people. I mean, and you walk in, they offer you a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, you sit down and you drink it, you say, I can only stay this long, but to be there and to establish those relationships and to enter and say, Mrs. Smith, what is your hope for Michael? Or what is your hope for Mary? Instead of saying, I'm here for a discipline problem, makes all the difference in the world.
And Lisa, can I just say, piggybacking on what Carla said, one of my regular practices was the first month to make sure I made some contact, usually a phone call. And I would tell the kids, your parents are going to hear from me this month. I would always, and it came about because my colleagues would send these letters home the first week of school about their expectations, and you got to be here on time, and you got to have your supplies, and it was like this list of demands. And I said to them once, I said, well, what are y'all going to do? Y'all are making all these demands on people. There's nothing in that letter saying this is what I'm willing to do. Right. So I decided I wouldn't write a letter like that. I wrote a letter that said, I'm delighted to have your student in one of my courses. I'm excited about the work we're going to do this year. Here's what you can expect of me. Yeah. I will be here. Yeah. I will, I usually come early. I usually stay late. Here are times you can reach me. And before the month is out, you should expect to hear from me. And when I would make that phone call, I was always shocked by how many parents said they never had a phone call like that before. They never had a phone call where it was just, how are you doing? Excited to have your student in my class. This is what we're looking forward to. What are your expectations for your? Never, ever had that phone call. They said every phone call I've ever received has been a negative phone call. When I did that, it went so far in helping to develop the relationship so that when I did have to have a difficult conversation, I already had something for people to lean on and say, well, yeah, she did call us and reach out and do these positive things. So I think some of our basic human relations skills need to be honed so that we can make sure that we reach out to these parents as opposed to always being in adversarial roles with them.
Yeah.
I think the only thing I would add is like there's, students young, across K-12 always appreciate the opportunity to be heard, to have a voice in the classroom. So while Carl, and I agree with everything Carl and Gloria were saying, and I have my own examples, but with regard to students, and most of my work, like I said, has been with Chicano Latino students in California and now here in Wisconsin, Students always appreciate when you not only have high expectations for them, but they are heard and allowed to kind of bring their whole self into the classroom, and they're embraced as people, not just as students or as learners, but as people. And so I think in trying to think about developing these relationships, it's important not just with families. I would also say like community organizations, community members that might be doing work in a similar vein around some critical issues. I think students can be a great, part of a coalition as well, right? Like they are the most impacted by these kind of debates that are happening, and they're in the middle of it, and they do have opinions and they do have thoughts. And so I taught elementary school, even 7-year-olds appreciate and value and light up when you make a connection to not just their language, but their home life, their community life. When you show up in their community and in their homes, that makes them feel seen. And so not only does that, I think, promote learning, but could promote some future coalition building.
And can I just say that today I got a text from a friend who is a high school principal in Baltimore. One of the things we haven't talked about is that 150,000 of our children have lost a parent in COVID. And she had a youngster at her high school whose mother died. And the text said, Dr. So-and-so, this is, and she gave her name. And she said, I really would like to go to prom, but things are tough for us. And I just not going to have the money for a dress. I told that principal, I said, send me your Cash App. And she told me I was maybe about the 6th person who had asked that same thing, that we were sending money. And so she says, it's now become a prom fund. It's not just for this young girl, because there's a lot of kids who are in this situation. But I think a lot of times we suffer in silence. Well, we say after the event, this terrible thing happened, where we don't make ourselves vulnerable and say, look, there's a need right here, and I need you to help me meet it.
Thank you. Just wanted to make eye contact with Cavi to see if you had any other insight into coalition building and how that's working for you in your current practice or in the past.
I would absolutely echo everything that everyone else is saying. I think absolutely the community looks to teachers. I think they trust teachers. I think they appreciate teachers. And I think all the things that the other professors had mentioned are things that are important, especially the positive phone call. Like that is something that I do every single year. I usually leave a voicemail. Sometimes I catch the parent and there's that awkward pause when they're like, well, why are you calling me again? And I just tell them I just appreciate their kid. And there's that like long exhale that you get from the parent who's like grateful that you're calling for something positive because they were bracing for something negative. So absolutely to all of that.
Thank you. We have 2 questions that feel sort of like cousins to each other. So I'm going to offer them both up and then connect with y'all. One is from Alejandro Atilio Nunez. I'll put it in the chat, but it's, Gloria, you've written about the post-pandemic reset. A lot of us have talked about the pandemic tonight and the various pandemics we're sort of swimming in simultaneously. And so their question is, what are some short-term and long-term goals, actions that can be taken both in and out of the classroom to address the necessary education reset? And then the cousin question that I saw from Lynn is, what is the single most important policy change that will most improve K-12 education for all students in the US? So what I'm hearing underneath these questions is, what it does or should the reset look like? And what might that mean from a policy change perspective?
Well, I think we've actually given lip service to this notion of social emotional learning. I'm actually getting a little bit tired of it being tossed out there. Let me just be real practical. there was no need for us to just open school doors and say, everybody come back. We didn't have to do it that way. We could have had our students come back in smaller increments, maybe just bring freshmen back in a high school, or the sixth graders in a middle school, or the kindergarten first graders in elementary school, because they hadn't been in school at all. We could have brought everybody back, but just portions of the day. You know, I was thinking about this because on the university campus, here we bring what we call the best and the brightest. They're smart, they're clever, they know how to do all kinds of things. And we take a week with them, orienting them to what it feels like to be away from home and be in this new environment. And yet we've taken this great mass of people and just said, oh, y'all just come back. And people were acting like it didn't happen. So I just want us to be a lot more planful about the whole person, the whole child, the whole teenager, to have conversations about, well, what did you do during the time you were away? You know, I've talked to a bunch of teenagers, most of them told me, you know what, I picked up more hours on my job. So I've earned a lot more money. I had to do it because we were struggling. Nobody has that conversation with young people. It's just like, no, we're reading Scarlet Letter, so let's just get to it. We also made transitions, I think, in most high schools to move the SROs, the school resource officers, either out or to minimize the number, but we didn't talk about what we were going to put in their place. We have them because the kids are struggling with stuff. They don't stop struggling with them because you take the SRO out. So one example you might have seen on the national news was that there was a lot of fighting. And that's been happening actually in schools across the country. I have a son who teaches school in the Sacramento area, and he says, Mom, we have more fights and more lockdowns, and we've never had this before. And it is about the kids' level of anxiety and uncertainty that we're not dealing with. But there was a school, I believe, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and they were just having all these fights. The fathers said, you know what, we're gonna be there. And they went out and got themselves some color coordinated t-shirts. I think they were orange or whatever. They had no training, but they just showed up. And they just stood in hallways or stood in doorways and greeted kids. And it gave them a sense of comfort. That here is a set of adults who are here. They're just here for us. They're not here to teach anything. They're not trying to get us through any tests. They're not evaluating us on anything. They just are here to show they care for us. So I think we really did need an opportunity. And let me just say, the teachers have been through the pandemic too. So they have social emotional needs. There are teachers who had to try to figure out how to teach and also care for their own kids. There are teachers who have family members who were lost in the midst of this. And again, we just opened up the door and said, come back to work. We did not have a serious plan. I'm actually doing a presentation for Texas A&M tomorrow, and I've called it, You're Not Okay. And that's okay. Because that's really where we are right now. We're not okay, and we will not own up to it. Until we've sort of faced some of this trauma, I think we're just going to continue to muddle along, struggle along, and be unsuccessful in the process.
I'm going to make space for our other panelists. I'm watching your mute and unmute buttons, but I also like that y'all, for the last question, sort of felt comfortable piggybacking on one another, but just thinking, what does the reset look like for us? What are the policy changes we want seen?
Well, see, my thoughts go like this. I mean, well, we're still with COVID, but it was saying, let's go back to school. And I think very little attention has been paid to what do we do? Where is the transformation? Gloria calls it a reset. That's fine. Baldwin talks about a transformation a reimagining of schools. I mean, schools need to be reimagined because the students who have been out of school have learned, students who have also experienced what is going on in society, these different trials that are going on, what's happening with coaches saying with the National Football League. The youth is aware of those kinds of things. They see that in society, there needs to be a change. Plus, they hear about critical race theory. I mean, students hear about that. So they are saying, what does that mean to me? What does that mean to us? So to go back to school and it's the same old, does that mean they're going to be more interest in returning to school or more saying, why isn't school changing to meet our needs?
Lisa, you had mentioned that paper, and so it's not a plug for the paper. It's my colleague Nicole and I, for a special issue that Carl Grant and Erica Bullock put together. We sort of were thinking about this question, and it was anti-racist school post-pandemic. And when we reflected on everything, we settled on this idea of love, because like Gloria said, it's not just kids going through it, right? Their parents, we're all going through it. And so we drew on this idea of love as a necessary corrective to centuries of oppression and subordination. And, you know, to Gloria's point about the multiple pandemics we're dealing with, we love that idea. We love that idea of love as you know, a way to respond in a moment when we don't know how people are going to fare personally, emotionally, psychologically, et cetera, in all the ways, in terms of learning in all the ways. And we're still in the pandemic, but we don't know how people are going to fare. But we do know that we've all been through something. We're still going through it. It feels like there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but you know, if we have to understand ourselves and anticipate the fullness of the way that we'll get past this on the other side of, at least in terms of the actual COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think my answer to that is to being more loving. And in the article, we talked about, you know, teachers and educators loving children, but also loving each other, right? And parents and community members loving teachers as well, because they're also going through this pandemic. So I think my response to like what a reset would look like in the near future is to be more humble and kind and loving, you know, however that can look and could look in your own context, because we're still going through it. And like Gloria, you know, cited the number of students that have lost parents, you know, and just the stressors of professors are going through it too, right? My toddler's daycare closes all the time, and it's like juggling life and work. And then guess what? Your toddler's gonna be home with you for 2 weeks. You know, there's just a lot of stress and nerve wracking around it. And so I think that was our sort of reflection on how we might relate to one another post-pandemic.
I would only add that I really hope that we can talk about retaining teachers and keeping teachers in the profession. You know, I'm the old man in my department. I've been in the Verona High School for 21 years, and I've never had a colleague leave mid-year. That has never happened. And this year that has happened way too many times, unfortunately. And our school is not alone in that. I worry that we're not making this profession sustainable for people. I think there needs to be sustainable structural changes to make it more sustainable. I had a colleague recently that left the classroom. She was a brilliant teacher. And she told me that I could either be a great mom or I could be a great teacher. And I'm tired of making that choice. And, you know, part of it is money, but part of it is also how we structure this job. And teaching is full of people that are givers, that are people that love working with others and are willing to give. But I think for even teachers, the last 2 years have been too much. And you're seeing that with the rates of people signing up for teacher ed programs. You're seeing that with, talk to any HR director at a local school district about, you know, hard to fill positions. And that is growing, unfortunately. So not only would I like to have a much more diverse workforce, but I'd also like to have a workforce that actually is staying in the profession, because I know that my first 3 years of teaching, I struggled. And it wasn't until I think the 4th year that I felt like I really knew what I was doing. But it takes some time to kind of develop that.
And I would just like to say, you know, what Mariana's point about just trying to juggle the various things in our lives and the stressors. You know, we hear people say, well, you know, we all been through the same, we're all in the same boat. And I always stop people right there and say, no, we're not. We're all in the same storm. But some people have gone through the storm on a luxury liner. I mean, they went home, all of their work came with them. They were able to work from there. Their checks kept rolling in. But there are those who have gone through this storm holding on to a bit of driftwood. They are literally trying to hold their heads up above the water. And, you know, Cavi's point about the restructuring of the profession, I think we get stuck in these places where we believe this is the only way it could be. Carl and I have had the luxury, and probably Mariana too, but I know Carl and I, because we've traveled together before, of seeing teaching in international contexts where people don't do it like this. We see more prestige being accorded to colleagues, to teachers of pre-collegiate students. We see people with planning time and cooperative and collaborative times. So the way we've structured it is not the only way it has to be. And we could actually be learning from our international peers about how to make it a more attractive profession, how to make it a profession that draws more people. And I'm so glad that Cavi brought that point up, because it's not even about diverse teachers at this point. It's just teachers. We are struggling to fill these teaching roles. When I came to Madison 31 years ago, you had to stand in a line that was 8 or 9 deep to even get an interview, because there were no jobs for you. Now there are jobs everywhere. They are begging for teachers. And that says something about what's happening in the profession.
Thank you, Gloria. I really appreciate that, the metaphor of us all being in a storm, different boats, different tools. That was striking to me. We wanted to open up a slightly new pasture. There's lots of great questions left in the chat, and I invite, if anybody's comfortable leaving their email address or wants somebody to follow up with them, please let us know. We've got so many more questions than we have time to answer. But one of the ways that we always like to make space for each other during these conversations is the question in the chat. And what I'll do is kind of start with Cavi, then Mariana, then Gloria, and then Carl. Is just sort of, what is one insight gained from the work or experiences of someone here today that you will take with you? So something someone said or something that came through in the chat that is kind of new for you or striking that you'll take with you. So if it's all right, Cavi, I'll start with you.
Well, I feel like a student in these professors' classes. So thank you so much for all of your insights. You know, I was just really struck by the different perspectives in terms of establishing coalitions, the context in which Baldwin wrote his speech about how, you know, it was really no different than what's happening today, and that also that perspective about mental health is also a huge one. That's something that absolutely I believe in, and that we are not reimagining. And I loved what Professor Lassen Billings had talked about how we could have used this time period as a real reset, and how we are in such a rush to come back. That it kind of, I think, allowed us to not reimagine the space in a way that was, I think, more advantageous for kids. And Professor Pacheco, I just really appreciated, talking about Gloria Enzaldúa and the work you're doing with your kids. Her essay actually is How to Tame a Wild Tongue. I actually teach that in AP Lang, and it's such an affirming essay, especially for my Chicano kids, who for the first time, they're able to see themselves in their essays. So thank you for bringing her up as well. So it's just been a real honor. So thank you, everyone.
Oops. I can go next. Oops. Oh, I can go next. I don't know if, yeah, I got a message, sorry. I think what I will take away is the importance and value of relationship building at multiple levels. I mean, I think, we were talking about coalition building, but ultimately it was about relationships that really could drive, and I would add, I guess what I'm taking away is like relationships even across difference. Relationships across difference that could potentially foster and advance educational change and transformation. The other thing related to that is about change being local, that while things are happening at the national level or state level, or even within your own kind of legislation, I'm taking away the idea that, the people standing with you, next to you, are the most important resource, not just for thinking and for making it through the day and feeling supported, but also for affecting change. Yeah, I think those are the things that I'm taking away.
I think my takeaway is a reminder that Mariana shared with us several times of in many ways, the work of our colleague, Louise Mall, that funds of knowledge are not just located in adults, that the students themselves are funds of knowledge. And I kind of pair that with Cavi's point about taking 3 to 4 years to sort of get his grounding as a teacher, probably because it takes us 3 to 4 years to figure out that we really should be studying the students. We're so caught up in studying pedagogy, studying content. But once you really take serious the notion that the students have something to teach us, because they'll teach us how to teach them, that we are too often leaving that resource on the table. We're walking away from classes and schools and not paying attention to this incredible resource of young people, and it can be very, very young children who continue to teach us the kinds of questions. I visited a 5th grade classroom last week in Hillsborough County, and I was so struck by the insights that the students had and the questions that they raised. And I was like, man, I forgot how smart these people are. I should have studied up a little more. I think we don't talk enough about that, and I think about our work. I sometimes make a crude analogy between teaching, education, and healthcare. And when you realize that in healthcare, the real point of service is the nurse. It's not the doctor. If you end up in the hospital, your doctor's going to come on rounds and they're going to make some prescriptive notes, but it's going to be the nurse who will be right there, who will, if you ring the buzzer, a nurse is coming. A doctor is not coming, okay? The nurse is coming. And in many ways, the work we do is in teaching is at that point of service. We don't get to make policy, but we get to provide the face-to-face, one-on-one care, if you will. So, Mariana has talked about love as a corrective. I've gone back and forth over this notion about whether or not love is a necessary component. And you're convincing me slowly but surely. I've said that it wasn't because I think about teachers who teach in penitentiaries, and it's really hard to be there with somebody is a rapist, right, or a murderer. But what I've said is it's actually the term I like is the term that Jeff Duncan Andrade uses, and that is cariño, that you have to care. That it has to matter to you what happens to this person, that you have to see what happens to this person as having consequences for the quality of the life that you can live. And so while I might not quote love them, and I often would say when people would say in a interview to come in and teach ed that they just love kids, I would always ask the question, well, what do you do about the ones that are not that lovable? And I could ask that question because I had two that were not that lovable. Of the four, two are really lovable, but the other two, ooh, right? But they are still entitled to the best education that you can give them. So I actually like the term cariño. How do we begin to show the care that our young people? So I take away, again, just mining the expertise of our students.
My takeaway is remembering Mariana's mother's portrait. This is about the second or third time I've been with Mariana in a similar setting when she's read her mother's portrait. And more she talks about her mother and her mother's portrait. And so I come away with thoughts about the portrait, and it also, in many ways, it tells me about Mariana. I mean, when Mariana starts talking about her mother's portrait, there's a little difference there, where she goes back to where she is her mother's, she's the daughter of her mother, and that is always enjoyable. And the poetry is just profound. I mean, to be able to listen to, because the message is so powerful. It was good. I take away from Gabby is just so wonderful hearing him talk about his craft in teaching and how he thinks about teaching. And the fact that he's been there 21 years is a message. And it says something that is very powerful. And so that's a pleasure to take away the spirit in which he says it. And with Gloria, it's always good traveling along with her in one way or the other and listen, whether she's calling it a reset. I would want to more call it what Baldwin calls it, the need for transformative love, that gets both the love in there and the need for change. And the whole notion of reimagining in this particular moment, in this particular time, when all that is going on in this world, that I would say, how do we deal with these things within schools? How do we teach about what's going on in society today, in schools of education, and in our K-12 schools, public schools, which Cavi has also said was so important in being a teacher in a public school. And then just also the other thing that I personally take away is the pleasure of doing this and having an opportunity to engage and to hear the questions that people are raising. Because that tells us about what people are thinking through their questions.
Thank you for each taking a turn to reflect on our conversations. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Percival to offer some closing thoughts.
Can you hear me? So sometimes when you are preceded by giants, you see people and they say things like, it's hard to follow that. But today my job is easy because all I have to do is summarize some of the wealth of things that they put out there. And what I want to do first is I want to thank our panelists, right? We have obvious luminaries. We've got Carl Grant, we've got Gloria Ladson-Billings, we've got Force of Nature and Mariana Pacheco. And I especially want everybody to give it up for Cavi Hong, who came in today and you guys couldn't see it beforehand. And he felt intimidated because it was all I am as a teacher. He's teacher of the year. He interacts with the New York Times and all sorts of media organizations in a way that lots of us don't. And he's in the trenches every day. And still, when he gets up here, is citing more people than I do in the average talk. So he's a scholar too. So Cavi, you are a national treasure. And we're glad that you were with us. Reflecting on some of the things that were said today, it's clear that we are living through a very dangerous time. And again, we are beset by, not by outside forces, but from within. And approaching this means engaging in a critical perspective. And one of the things that Dr. Grant asked is, do we have a vision? Do we have a vision for what education should be, right? You don't want to let the good prices go to waste. Schools need to be reimagined. So one of the things about COVID is that we came out and people wanted to do the same. And the question that we might ask ourselves, the question that we often answer when we say, hey, can we change this? It's like, do we have to go back to normal? Can we reset? COVID told us that the answer is yes. In your life, have you ever seen an opportunity for stepwise, radical change from one day to the next? Think about it. Schooling popped online, delivery of services changed, consumptions changed. Anybody who says that we cannot change and then we cannot change fast, it's dead wrong. It's right in front of our faces. So we can. So it goes back to the question of something about the political will. And then again, do we have the vision for what education should be? Dr. Ladson-Billings pointed out that there is a difference in being bold and courageous and being reckless. The point is not to be a martyr, it's to affect change. And that really means it's not about the seat of the pants. There's a lot of planning and rationality that's involved in here. And so when we go back to those things that drive us, when we say, hey, look, there is no way that I cannot engage students in these things that are the issues of the day, these things, you know, she talked about this multiple pandemics, COVID, racism, economic pandemic, impending environmental catastrophe, right? Why am I glad I'm at Wisconsin? Because in 30 years, when everybody has a swim, maybe I'll be a little bit all right here. This is real life. Yeah, it's either not in the curriculum, or when people try to put it in the curriculum, we try to get it forced out. And for us to attack that, for us to deal with that, we cannot be reckless. There has to be planning and there has to be rationality. At the same time, we need to recognize where the knowledge can come from. One of the things that Mariana Pacheco pointed out was we construct so many differences as deficiencies, as opposed to looking at them as sources to enrich the knowledge that we come from. These border crossing experiences literally create new knowledges and create new ways of thinking about knowledge. And until we stop to center those student voices and experiences and let them hear their stories, we will not properly take advantage of that knowledge. Dr. Pacheco had this beautiful poet in her house. She reads this heart-rending, absolutely beautiful poem, but if you don't look for it, you won't see it. And that's part of what we have to do. And when we go back to Cavi Hong, who was in the trenches, here is somebody who grew up his whole life in America He said, I never read a book by someone who looked like me. I didn't even know that Asian Americans wrote literature until I went to college. So here is somebody who was raised in America, who contributes to raising our kids every day. And he says that he feels like a perpetual foreigner. And that's something that needs to change. And part of that is what we do as far as engaging students, children, and hearing their voices and asking them for their stories. And if we're going to be reflective practitioners, we have to question the goals and beliefs that guide our practices and ask, where is the student coming from? And then again, what should education look like? What is the vision? And the difficult question is, what is the vision? And then how do we make it happen? And the answer to how do we make it happen is obviously not easy, but one of the things that's come up today is to realize that we can, again, look at how much COVID changed, this discontinuous change. But like Dr. Billings said, it will not be overnight. You will meet the most brutal and determined resistance. And to that, I will add, you will find an intensely rational resistance. And to combat that, yes, it takes heart, but it also takes a plan. It takes recognizing that where your real fight is, you want to know where your real fight is. And maybe occasionally stopping and asking yourself, am I charging after windmills? And realize where it is that we need to direct our energy. It takes sitting on the board. It takes writing that op-ed. It takes having difficult conversations. It takes supporting our teachers who take all this, who face everything and get little pay. And Cavi Hong said it plainly, we have to retain our teachers. If there's a fifth pandemic, there we go, right? This is something we needed to start more than a decade ago. The first time I read, oh, they're gonna raise the minimum wage to $15 in Seattle. Oh, how are they gonna keep their teachers when the people at McDonald's, right? And we're already too late. We really need to change this way. One of the questions that we didn't get solid answers to were some of the policy things, and policy for retraining teachers is something that's really important. It should be at the top. Maybe the biggest take home, sometimes fighting the good fight is not always about fighting. It's about partnerships. And maybe love, maybe not, but definitely about the partnerships and the alliances. This can be hard to hear when you have righteous anger, when you have a reason to be upset, when you have had everything forced upon you, but it takes realizing, all the panelists said it at some point, it takes realizing that people are people and realizing that we can build coalitions, that sometimes you can do this with people you wouldn't even think to build relationships with. It might even mean sitting in a small house with a dead body and people who hate you because you look, the way you look. And if you tell them Gloria Billings said it, then maybe you can get people to try and build some coalitions in that way too. You know, again, it's going to take everything. It's going to take us, those of us who care, going for broke. And I really want to thank the panelists for those insights. I really want to thank you for pushing us to think harder about this. For the people here, there's a link to the survey that's going to be dropped into the, it's actually Amanda dropped in now. Please go ahead and share your thoughts with us. We'll be in touch soon about our next Real Talk, Real Change, which will be in late March, and it'll be about trans care. And the last thing I'll say is that I don't usually change colors during the day. This window is really bright. I will buy a lamp so the next time I look the same all the way through, okay? So thank you very much, and we see you guys next time.
Bye, good seeing everybody. Good seeing you, Gloria.